Hey everyone, welcome to episode 1 of Localism, the podcast that asks whether we're putting our power in the right place. Now featuring 100% less leaf blowers. Sorry for last time, I'm new to this whole podcasting thing and didn't notice that there was some background noise until after I'd posted the episode. I'm your host and candy bar critic Blunchley. In today's episode, Local Authority in America Part 1, Preemption and Dillon's Rule. For those that sat through episode 0, hopefully at 2 times speed, thanks for bearing with me. Today's episode is going to be a lot more grounded and a lot less about all the gushy stuff in my background. Last time, I talked about this weird tension that I've been thinking about at the middle of the American system of government, which is that the governments that are the closest and most responsive to our communities, city councils, county board of commissioners, stuff like that, actually have the least power to address our community's problems. What did I mean by that? What exactly is the scope of local government authority in America? Why can't your town council pass laws about all the stuff that your state legislature or the federal Congress can? Today's going to be about answering these questions. And at the risk of sounding like a clickbait article, the answer might surprise you. Let's take a step back into your grade school social studies class, or maybe your high school American history class. There's this idea that underlies how America came to be, this concept or conceit of delegation that led to the federal structure. Probably seems weird to start an episode about local authority by talking about how the federal government came to be, but stick with me, this is important. The idea goes something like this. After the Revolutionary War, the 13 colonies needed to figure out exactly what kind of political structure they were going to share post-war. Let me pretend to be a zoomer really quick. The colonies were in a situationship and they needed to sit down for a chat about what are we? And here's the story of what happened. The people of the colonies, really a bunch of rich old dudes that the other rich old dudes appointed, your average dude didn't have much of a say, and all the slaves definitely didn't have a say, all got together at this big convention to talk about how the colonies were or weren't going to work together. In the end, here's what they decided. The people of the colonies decided they were going to voluntarily give up some of the colony's inherent power to an overarching government that would then govern all of the colonies. This national government would be by and of the people. All of its authority was simply a delegation from the colonies, who were the original owners of that authority. The federal government's powers were the powers of the colonies being exercised by a joint body. And the scope of that authority could not exceed the scope that was set by the colony's consent. This ideological principle is reflected in the 10th Amendment of the Constitution, which reads, "The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited to it by the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people." So you can see that the 10th Amendment directly recognizes that the United States national government is exercising powers that the states have inherently, but that they've given to the federal government by delegation. So, okay, we've got this national government that's created by delegation from the states. One of the powers this national government has is to pass laws through Congress. But the states also still have power to pass laws. What happens if a state passes a law that conflicts with the law that the federal Congress passes? This is where something called preemption comes into play. In America, if a federal law and a state law, or a local law, conflict, then the federal law controls. The reason for why goes back to that same concept of delegation. Since the states voluntarily gave up some of their power to the federal government, that involved agreeing to abide by the rules of the joint government that would rule over all the states. It's what makes the federal government, and the Bill of Rights, actually have an effect, instead of just being suggestions that the states can choose to ignore if they want to. Here's kind of a silly example of how preemption works. Let's say Congress gets together and passes a law that says all state parks must ban the use of dirt bikes between the hours of 9 p.m. and 6 a.m. Then, I don't know, let's pick on Tennessee. Let's say Tennessee state legislature passes a law that says all our parks must allow the use of dirt bikes between the hours of 9 p.m. and 6 a.m. clearly the two laws contradict. Dirt bikes can't be both banned and allowed in the park at night at the same time. But under the doctrine of preemption, because the two laws contradict, the federal rule wins out. That's pretty straightforward, right? Maybe you agree with the idea that federal law should win out over state or local ones, and maybe you don't. But conflict preemption is at least easy to understand and apply. But conflict preemption isn't the only kind of preemption. And sometimes federal law wins out over state law in ways that are a bit more surprising or less intuitive. For example, there's this thing called field preemption. Under field preemption, a federal law or set of laws can override a state law even when there is no contradiction between the two. The theory behind this kind of field preemption is that Congress, or federal administrative agencies, can sometimes pass a law in a particular field or subject matter. And by passing that law, the federal government intended that the law be the sole and comprehensive amount of regulation in the specific field. Going back to our previous Tennessee dirt bike example, let's say that Congress creates this administrative agency called the National Park Dirt Bike Regulatory Board, the NPDRB. The NPDRB passes a big law that touches on all kinds of things about how dirt bikes can be used in parks. What CC is allowed, what colors are allowed, how fuel efficient they have to be, where can they be manufactured, stuff like that. But the law, let's call it the Dirt Bike Act, says absolutely nothing about what times dirt bikes can be used in state parks. So since there is no federal law that directly contradicts it, Tennessee passes a state law that says dirt bikes can't be used in our state parks from between 9 p.m. to 6 a.m. Should be no problem, right? The Dirt Bike Act doesn't say anything about what time dirt bikes can be used in state parks, so there's no contradiction. But the state law might be preempted anyway. It could be that a court would look at the federal Dirt Bike Act and say, the federal government wanted this to be the only regulation of dirt bikes in state parks. The idea is that the Dirt Bike Act would completely cover that field. So actually, the states can't regulate in the area of dirt bikes in state parks at all. The Dirt Bike Act was intended to be the comprehensive, sole regulation in this field. So the entire field is preempted, and Tennessee can't pass any kinds of laws about dirt bikes in state parks. Frankly, my opinion is that field preemption is kind of unfair. If we have a limited federal government, then unless the state law actively contradicts a federal law, then wouldn't it make more sense for the states to have the freedom to pass their own legislation? Maybe the federal government should have to be very specific when it wants to limit the agency of state and local governments, and that absent such specificity, the assumption should be that state and local governments retain their autonomy. But that's a bit besides the point. So now we've talked about how federal laws can preempt state laws. What does any of that have to do with the scope of authority for, like, your city council or your school board? Well, the reason I had to talk about all the federal stuff is that local laws get it doubly bad. They can be preempted by federal laws in all the same ways I described, but they can also be preempted by state laws, both by conflict preemption and field preemption. Let's change the dirt bike example around a little bit. Suppose that instead of the federal government, it's Tennessee that passes the Dirt Bike Act. Then Nashville passes a rule saying that dirt bikes can't be used in any municipal parks between 9 p.m. and 6 a.m. Sorry, Nashville, I've never been there. I have no idea if dirt bikes would even fit into the parks. Just play along with me for a minute. Unfortunately, Nashville then gets taken to court by the state. And the state says, sorry, we passed the Dirt Bike Act. And the Dirt Bike Act is supposed to be the comprehensive amount of state regulation of how dirt bikes can be used in parks. So even though the Dirt Bike Act doesn't specifically say there's certain times when dirt bikes can or can't be used in municipal parks, unfortunately your local law is preempted because of field preemption. Let's take a step back and think about how wild that is. Your local government doesn't have the ability to regulate on a ton of stuff, including a bunch of topics related to housing, healthcare, infrastructure, wages, all things that are wrapped up in your community's unique problems. Instead, the state government, which may be hundreds of miles away from you, and controlled by a political party that hates your guts, while simultaneously knowing nothing about what it's like to live where you do, gets to have the final say on all of that important stuff. And above them, the federal government, which is 100 times more distant than your state capital, and full of politicians who definitely have never stepped foot where you live, gets to override everything. Like, that's crazy. The people who are furthest from your community and are in the position to understand what goes on there the least have the most power to say how things work in it. But back to preemption. Okay. We get the theory for why federal preemption exists over state laws, right? Maybe you agree with this idea, maybe you don't, but the concept is that the people of the states came together and willingly delegated power to the federal government. In order for that delegation to have bite, the states decided to make the federal law be the law of the land. Otherwise, federal stuff like the Bill of Rights would just be suggestions that the states didn't have to follow. So you might think, okay, the U.S. is made up of a lot of states that came together and delegated their power to a higher level of government. If you look at any given state, it's made up of a bunch of cities and counties, a checkerboard of local governments, kind of like America is a checkerboard of state governments. So you might reasonably think that, sort of like the same reason why federal law preempts state law, maybe state law preempts local law, because these little governments and the people living in them had this inherent power of self-rule. But they decided to exercise that inherent power of self-rule by coming together and forming an overarching political unit and governing body. So while the local governments came together and they decided to delegate some of their inherent power to the state government, it's like the whole process that gave rise to the United States of America, but in miniature. So you might think that every state is a mini-America, with the state government sort of being the quote-unquote federal government to the local government's quote-unquote state governments. That seems pretty reasonable, right? That does seem reasonable, but it's also totally wrong. The reason state law preempts local law is entirely different than the reason federal law preempts state or local law. And talking about that reason will help understand the principle that delineates the scope of local authority for your city or county. To explain that principle, which applies to most, not all, but most counties and cities, we need to jump again into another 6th grade history lesson. This time about Iowa, the 1800s, railroads, and a judge named John F. Dillon. So it's the post-Civil War 1800s. Railroads are spreading themselves across the country. Meanwhile, American citizens are grappling with all sorts of problems. One of those problems is that local governments are often extremely corrupt. If you think graft is bad now, it was way worse back in the mid to late 1800s. This is the peak of what's called the Gilded Age. Corporations, especially the new big railroad companies, were rising to levels of wealth and power never before seen in the nation's history. There was no proportional anti-corruption response. Companies got to buy off whoever they wanted, and they had the money to do it. And mayors and aldermen and city council members were cheaper on the dollar than federal politicians, usually. So railroads would waltz into a city, buy off the local leaders, and then do pretty much whatever the hell they wanted. People who lived in the cities and counties were reasonably getting pretty fucking pissed. They wanted someone to rein in these local abuses. So some people started looking to state governments, state legislatures, to exert a heavier hand over local governments and take away powers that were being misused. But at the same time, guess what? The railroads and other businesses were buying off state politicians too. So sometimes the dynamic would work in reverse. A railroad would roll into town and start making all these demands or trying to buy up land. The locals wouldn't play along, so the railroads would go to their puppets in the state or federal government and get them to overrule what the people in the community wanted. Then the people in those communities would, reasonably, get fucking pissed and ask why these distant politicians got to dictate things in the community from afar. So all this conflict, these issues of corruption and overreach, resulted in this really interesting debate about the scope of local authority. The question at the center of this debate was simple. What exactly is a local government? Let's use a county as an example. What is a county? Is it a kind of political body with inherent authority and independent existence that derives power from the popular sovereignty of the people who live in it? Or is it this ultimately subordinate thing, a kind of servant or department or organ of the state government? Well, we got an answer to that question over the course of a few decades, but the Big Bang moment happened in Iowa in 1868. There's this town in Iowa called Clinton. At the time, Clinton City Charter, a city or county charter is like the document that says what a local government's powers are. It's kind of, but not really, like a mini constitution. Clinton City Charter said that city council had the, quote, exclusive care, supervision, and control of all streets in the city. But there was a railroad company that wanted to build railroads through Clinton, including through its streets. The Iowa state government passed this law in 1860 that said the railroad company shall build a railroad through Clinton. For whatever reason, I wasn't able with my own amateur research to find a source explaining why. Clinton didn't want this railroad to be built on its streets. So the city council goes to the state's courts. and sues the railroad company to keep it from building on Clinton streets. The Clinton City Council makes a couple of arguments for why the railroad shouldn't come in, but the one we care about is that City Council claims that since the city charter gives it power over the streets, nothing can get built on the streets without the council's approval, even if the state passes a contrary law. Basically, it's saying that if its charter conflicts with state law, the charter should win out. Now, since we just spent a bunch of time talking about why local law, including charters, never win out over state or federal authority, you probably know what's about to happen. But the reasoning is interesting. The case ends up going all the way up to the Iowa State Supreme Court, and one Judge John Dillon writes the opinion deciding the matter. So what does Judge Dillon have to say? Does the charter control, or does the state law control? Does Clinton have its own independent authority and sovereignty, or is it subordinate to the state? Here's the famous words. These are the words that Dillon wrote, words that have since gone on to live in fame or infamy depending on who you ask. Local governments, like cities, quote, owe their origin to and derive their powers and rights wholly from the legislature. Here he's talking about state legislatures. He continues, quote, as it creates, so it may destroy. If it may destroy, then it may abridge and control. Unless there is some constitutional limitation on the right, the legislature might, by a single act, if we can suppose it capable of so great a folly and so great a wrong, sweep from existence all of the municipal corporations in the state. Then a parting shot. Municipal corporations, or local governments, are, quote, the mere tenants at will of the legislature. Let me translate this a little bit. What Judge Dillon is saying is that the local government has absolutely no independent authority or existence separate from state government. A state government can create or destroy a local government at any time for any reason by passing a law via the state legislature. A local government is just a servant of the state government with no inherent right to exist, no inherent sovereignty, no inherent ability to self-rule, and no inherent ability to deny the state legislature unless something in the state or federal constitution says otherwise. So if Iowa says a railroad is going to be built through Clinton, there isn't shit Clinton can do to stop it. The state law wins out over the local law. It preempts it because local government exists only at the whim of the state government, and the state can limit the local government's authority however it pleases, including by overriding the city's ability to govern over streets. We'll get into the ramifications of this a little more in a second, but first, let's talk a bit about why an 1868 Iowa Supreme Court ruling became the basis for how local authority is defined in almost every American state. While Judge Dillon is on the bench, he writes a treatise, which is kind of like a legal guidebook called Municipal Corporations. It's published in 1872, so a few years after the case between the town of Clinton and the railroad. In this treatise, Judge Dillon restates the rule he had previously set out in the state court case. Local governments are just the creations of state governments, and so state governments can limit local authority in any way that a state pleases. But he also does something a bit different by describing the scope of local authority from a pragmatic, problem-based perspective, and restates what's called the Dillon Rule, named after Judge Dillon, as a test you can use to determine whether or not a local government has the authority to do a particular action. Here's a quick and dirty description of the Dillon Rule. Local governments have only three kinds of powers. First, those that are expressly given to them by the state when the state legislature passes a town or county's charter. Second, those that are fairly implied by the express grants. Third, those that are essential to a local government's existence. In practice, this means that a local government only has the authority that is explicitly spelled out in its charter. If a town charter doesn't give the town the right to, for example, declare a local holiday, then the town probably can't do it. And even if the charter gives it authority in a certain area, say the ability to set property taxes, and the local government acts in that area, a state legislator can just override that action at any time by either A, passing a law that contradicts and thus preempts the local law, or B, amending the local government charter to withdraw the relevant power from the local government. So Dillon's treatise, Municipal Corporations, gets pretty popular and well respected. It's one of the first times in American history that someone had sat down and really tried to collect all of the rules and laws surrounding local governments into one treatise. Almost every state adopts the Dillon Rule of local governments not having any authority aside from what's specifically spelled out in their charters. It gets so popular that the federal Supreme Court reads it and likes what it sees. In the 1907 case Hunter versus City of Pittsburgh, the federal Supreme Court cites to the Dillon Rule and municipal corporations, the treatise, and says this: municipal corporations are political subdivisions of the state, created as convenient agencies for exercising such of the governmental powers of the state as may be entrusted to them. The state, therefore, at its pleasure, may modify or withdraw all such powers, may take without compensation such property, hold it itself, or vest it in other agencies, expand or contract the territorial area, unite the whole or a part of it with another municipality, repeal the charter, and destroy the corporation. All this may be done, conditionally or unconditionally, with or without the consent of the citizens, or even against their protest. So basically, the Dillon Rule is perfectly constitutional, both on a federal level and usually on a state level. And local governments are just convenient little things, little limbs that the state creates as servants to do the state legislature's bidding. Let's think about what this means for us. Going back to the beginning of this episode, we talked about how the theory of legitimacy for the federal government works. The idea is that all the states came together and delegated some power that the states had inherently, to the federal government. It was a voluntary thing. And because of that, because the states were just delegating some of the power that they otherwise inherently had, the states retain all powers that don't explicitly say they've been delegated to the federal government. So if we zoom into the state level, we might expect that a sort of similar thing happened, that there's a similar legitimating principle that lets us draw a line from popular sovereignty and the will of the people to why state laws should win out over local laws. We might expect that what happened was a checkerboard of local governments came together and exercised the will of the people to delegate some power to an overhanging state government. But that's not the case at all. It is the total opposite. The state creates local governments and then tells them what to do, not the other way around. In fact, local governments can't do anything without the explicit permission of state legislatures. Local governments have no inherent authority or powers in most of America. And because local governments are the ones that are closest to you, where your vote matters the most, where you can go and see your local representatives the most easily, and that are most responsive to your problems and have to be because you are the voter base, those local governments, they have no inherent authority or power, which means that functionally, under the Dillon Rule, you have no inherent authority or power to tackle the serious problems facing your community. Let me repeat that. The form of government that is closest to citizens, where individual votes matter the most, that is most responsive to citizen needs, has no inherent authority. Its citizens have no political power except for what the state government decides to give them. This just seems facially insane. I mean, imagine if after the Revolutionary War, the federal government had gone, the states don't exist anymore. We're getting rid of them. Instead, we are going to make all new states. And these states can only do what we tell them to do. And we can get rid of them at any time if we feel like it, or fold them into new states, or break them into smaller states. Congress can't just pass a law and say Texas doesn't exist anymore if it does something to piss Congress off. But if the state legislature of Texas decides that it really hates, I don't know, let's say Dallas, then it could just pass a law that says Dallas doesn't exist anymore. Or the Texas state legislature can amend Dallas's charter so that it effectively has no authority to do even the most basic things. And so its voters have effectively no authority to handle stuff in their own backyard. The relationship between local governments and the states versus the states and the federal government is just so imbalanced. At least state governments get the 10th Amendment that says anything not explicitly delegated to you, the federal government, is a power that we, the states, still have. The Dillon Rule is kind of like an anti-10th Amendment. Instead of getting to say the state only gets the powers we delegate to it, it makes local governments say we only have the powers that the state decides to hand us down, to toss down from us from the kitchen table. Maybe others would disagree, but this just seems like an unjust system. Just government is government that expresses the will of the people, that exists as a legitimate exercise of how people want to be governed. A government is legitimate only if it exists or doesn't exist as an extension of citizen consent. if you believe all of this, then in a city or county, it should be the people who live in that city or county who say how much power the local government gets, how it exercises that power, and how it may or may not choose to delegate that power to a higher body. But that's just not how it works in America. Because instead, it's the state government and state legislatures who get to say that. And except for maybe one or two people, nobody in the state legislature was chosen by the people who live in your community. The people in the state legislature instead represent other communities that may have very different values and problems and beliefs than you have. So ultimately, it's the people who live outside your community, outside of your city or town or county, who have the most power to say how things should be run in your own backyard. And I just don't see how that's consistent with the idea of government as only being legitimate when it expresses the will and consent of the governed. I don't see how that's consistent with the whole idea of how America was born, that higher governments exist only as delegations of powers that the people inherently have. A lot of what we're going to talk about in future episodes is how to depart from this system, rearrange the dynamic into something that's more just, a system where local agency and local consent is the bedrock of the political system, and local governments have the power to express the values and decisions of the people who live in them. But before we go down that route, and before I do any more ranting about popular sovereignty or whatever the fuck, there's another piece of the story that we have to talk about. I've kind of been implying that the Dillon rule is how things work in all of America. That's actually not true. There's another principle over the scope of local authority, one called home rule, that sets out the boundaries of local authority in a small but significant minority of states. Home rule functions under an entirely different set of assumptions. And even beyond home rule, there was a judge other than Dillon who, around the same time, laid out his own vision for how local authority should function in America, a vision that goes beyond even home rule. Next time, we talk about home rule, how it differs from the Dillon rule, and what Judge Thomas Cooley had to say about local authority. If that sounds interesting, think about following the show on Spotify, or shoot me a question at localistpod@gmail.com. That's localistpod@gmail.com. A huge thank you to Kevin MacLeod for letting me use the two songs in this podcast, Acid Jazz and Opportunity Walks. You can find these and a bunch of other really great songs on Kevin's website, incompetech.com. And the use of Kevin's music here is licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 4.0.